well, there was 40,000 leaflets put out in East Belfast that
Hmm.
said exactly that we were traitors, and it ended up sadly in quite a few of my colleagues being attacked. That was 10 years ago. I think that people now look at it and go, do you know what? You know, as others have said, John Hume, I think it was, said, you can't eat a flag.
This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 144 for the 29th of September 2022. I saw a load of comments from commentators online, from talking heads on radio and TV, from people on Twitter, that the mobilization order by Putin last week to try to shore up his invasion of Ukraine was stupid. It was stupid to try to mobilize people with no military experience. It was stupid to think that they could have any effect against high-precision, long-range weapons that the Ukrainians are now getting. It was stupid not to consider that they would have no experienced officers. It was stupid not to understand that this lack of leadership is a key reason why Russia is losing. It was stupid not to consider the destabilizing effect that this order would have on the population in Russia. It was stupid to have all the skilled young men fleeing over the closest border. It was stupid, stupid, stupid. I'm not convinced. This made me think of Elon Musk's Hyperloop. In case you don't know, Elon Musk, the boss of Tesla, who is listed as the world's richest man, has proposed and apparently started working on a high-speed mass transport system that would involve a sort of train inside a vacuum tube. With all the air evacuated from the tube and no wind resistance, people could be transported at over 1,000 kilometers an hour, as fast as a jetliner. This has gained him huge publicity and quite a bit of political traction. Musk has also proposed underground tunnels and rail systems that would move cars around with huge efficiency, and argued that he could construct tunnels and tubes like these to connect major American cities and indeed world cities. And he would begin by connecting San Francisco and Los Angeles with travel times that seem fantastic compared to the driving times in car-choked Southern California. Fantastic as in a fantasy. There have been no shortage of people pointing out that this project is impossible. It will never happen. The cost of tunnelling is hugely expensive, very time-consuming and a legal nightmare in densely populated areas like California, with disputes about title, risk of subsidence, not to mention the safety risks of having accidents and fires in inaccessible tunnels, and the potential for huge congestion at entry and exit points. The idea of a train in a vacuum tunnel is even more hot nonsense. There doesn't even exist a proposal for how air might be evacuated from such a vast space as an intercity tunnel, let alone any equipment that could do it. And even if that could be achieved, there's no design proposal, there isn't even any material known to humanity that could withstand the gigantic stresses of the outside atmosphere bearing down on the vacuum. And even if you could propose a design and materials, it would be certain to include internal struts, which would make it impossible to run a train through the space. If you're interested, there is no shortage of YouTube videos on this, ridiculing Musk's plans, and they make a good education on the physics and the engineering and the logistics that show that this proposal is just totally impossible for a whole host of reasons. And along the way, you can have a good chuckle at just how stupid Elon Musk, the world's richest man, was to propose this in the first place. Check out the channels of Thunderfoot or Kurzgesagt if you want to laugh along. But here's the thing. He's the world's richest man. Could he really be that stupid? Being the world's richest man certainly doesn't prove that you're the world's smartest man, Musk has been lucky in his life for sure, but luck alone can't explain his success. He can't be that stupid, can he? He can't, and he isn't. If someone who objectively can be seen to be smart seems to be doing something stupid, maybe you should reconsider who it is who doesn't understand what's going on. California High-Speed Rail is a state-owned, State of California-owned rail project currently under construction from San Francisco to Los Angeles, and also planned to extend from Sacramento to San Diego and to link many other cities. It's a real project. It's being built right now using real technology. It will run real trains on real lines at speeds of up to 350 kilometers an hour. And, as I said, it's owned by the state of California. It's a response to public pressure against traffic chaos and car dependency. And, as I said, Elon Musk owns a car company, Tesla. California High-Speed Rail is a direct competitor for the motor car, as would be any future similar projects that might be inspired by its success, and the success of high-speed rail in the US would hurt Tesla's sky-high share price, which much of Musk's wealth depends on. There was, of course, much controversy in California about the development of the high-speed rail system. A lot of political inertia and opposition had to be overcome, and no small amount of that came from the fact that people were hearing about Musk's Hyperloop, which sounded much better, much cheaper, and much faster. Musk has been talking about this for 10 years, although his company supposedly developing the system has less than 200 employees and doesn't seem to be doing anything much other than publicity stunts. But, just maybe, that's the whole point. Maybe Musk isn't as dumb as Thunderfoot or Kurzgesagt or all those other nerdy analysts make out. Maybe Musk looks at the hype going round in a loop as a pretty good value way of undermining support for the public transport system that threatens his vast fortune. And as for Putin, maybe he's not as dumb as all the commentators think either. Sure, he's being protected by his lackeys from all the bad news. Sure, he thinks the world smells of fresh paint because wherever he goes is freshly painted. But a lot of his enemies are dead and he's not, yet. So it's worth considering that he may not be all that stupid. First of all, it's clear that the mobilization is bigger, maybe much bigger, than the 300,000 announced. It is perhaps 1.2 million men, but it could be significantly more. It's also being concentrated in poorer, rural and particularly ethnic minority areas of Russia, of which there are a lot. There has been a lot of chatter that the failing war in Ukraine could lead to the breakup of Russia. Maybe like how the Soviet Union broke up 30 years ago, or maybe more violently. Personally, I think that's unlikely, but it's possible that, rightly or wrongly, Putin doesn't. And if you are afraid of that happening, what better thing to do than to gather up all of the fighting age men and not even send them to Ukraine, just send them to training camps, thousands of kilometers from home where they don't know the people, they don't know the lie of the land and maybe don't speak the language, and just keep them busy there. And maybe you've seen all the videos of people, mostly young educated men, in traffic jams at every border crossing out of Russia from Finland to Mongolia, or buying up every available flight out of the country. Young, educated men, the exact demographic, and self-selecting the exact cohort from that demographic that is most opposed to Putin, and in a position to rebel. Sure, he's tanking the economy, but if you were Putin, would you really be that heartbroken to see that the people who might be taking to the streets of Moscow to oust you are instead taking to every other means of transport to leave the country. And for the very few who are protesting against the war, they're carted off by the police, and many of the males among them are being served with their conscription notices right there in the police stations and put on a transport to what passes for military training camps. So even before a single untrained conscript with a rusty World War II era rifle sets a leaky boot on Ukrainian territory, the mobilization has helped Putin with a lot of his problems. That's not to say he won't still have a world of problems, and one of them might be underestimating his enemy, but that's a mistake that a lot of people should be careful about making. In a moment, we'll have that interview with Kelly Armstrong. But first, I want to say thanks to all of the patrons on Patreon. I really appreciate everyone who donates there. We don't get a huge amount of money out of it, not nearly in the same league as some other Irish podcasters I could mention. It pays for things like web hosting. Kevin and myself basically donate our time for free. It's also a great morale booster. When we get a new patron, we're really happy. It lets us know that there are people out there who are listening and appreciating the podcast. We make a big effort to cover things that are undercovered in the Irish media. You're more than welcome to listen for free, but if you think that you could do the same as the other donors and throw in the price of a trip from Moscow to Helsinki, or even the price of a trip on the Moscow Underground once or twice a month, there's details how to do that on the website and at the end of the show. On the line, I have Kelly Armstrong. Kelly has been the MLA for the constituency of Strangford since 1996, according to Wikipedia. Kelly, you were recently joined by a second Alliance Party member in your constituency, in your 5-seat constituency. But maybe just tell us very quickly a little bit about what Strangford is. What sort of place is it?
Strangford, I have to say, is the nicest place in the whole of the island of Ireland, to start that off. But it's so-called Strangford constituency because it's the area around Strangford Lough. It does have large town Newtownards, but the rest of the area is very rural. A lot of coastal communities. Politically, it would be quite a unionist-dominated area. Very few nationalists live in the area, and
I see in the recent elections, usually SDLP and Sinn Féin combined get less than 10% of the vote. It's basically the centre of County Down plus the Ards Peninsula. I guess that's what it is, and all of the non-alliance MLAs are unionists. And that was true even when there were 6 seats back prior to the Assembly shrinking slightly in, I think, 2017. Do you consider yourself a unionist?
No, I don't. I don't consider myself a nationalist. I consider myself to be a person of Northern Ireland, a person who is both British and Irish, but I don't spend my days worried about whether we're united with United Kingdom or united with United Ireland. I'm of my time a post or a Troubles baby. I see myself as somebody who my reason for being is not to fight to keep with the Union or to keep, to have a United Ireland. I'm something else.
Okay, I'll get to what your reason for being is in a moment. But just one thing that happened, you were interviewed on TV and I was talking to a colleague about this who was kind of quick to say this might have been misinterpreted a little bit. But so I'll allow you the space to give the correct interpretation. But you did say in one interview recently that given Brexit, given the difficulties over the Northern Ireland Protocol and various other issues with the London government, that you would be coming from a unionist background, even if you don't consider yourself a unionist, but moving towards being at least not hostile to Northern Ireland joining with the Republic. Do you want to maybe, in case you feel you were being misinterpreted, give us the full version of that?
Well, I always say I'm not from a unionist background. I grew up in quite a nationalist area, but my thoughts on it had been I'm happy where I'm at. However, the way that things have gone in more recent times, why would we stay part of a United Kingdom? Why would we go into United Ireland? My mind is now more open to the conversations. I want to hear more about what would happen to the health system, what would happen, to the education system, what would happen to all those thousands of people who work in a civil service job in Northern Ireland. I want to find out those before I could have said it doesn't really bother me at all. I'm happy where I'm at. There's no border between us. We can crack on. But since, especially since Brexit, that hardening of attitudes towards people who are of British and Irish background, it makes it a very difficult place to be. It almost feels like the United Kingdom and Westminster is trying to get rid of Northern Ireland by making things as difficult as possible. So my mind is open to all conversations.
Okay, that's a reasonable way to put it. I mentioned that the area that you represent, which I think you kind of are very familiar with, has never had not even a single nationalist MLA from any party, and just the population of the area is almost exclusively from the unionist background or from that family culturally. Although now, as I said, 2 of the 5 MLAs are from the Alliance Party. Since your very significant victory in the recent election, I should say to listeners, I can see over Microsoft Zoom's Kelly, and she just smiled when I said that. So congratulations on that. But essentially, I think a lot of the people, particularly in the South, maybe don't have a full understanding of the Alliance Party. And, if we are like you, Troubles baby, or, going back to that time, we kind of remember all the nationalist parties and the unionist parties, which was, they were essentially stalemate elections. Nothing really ever changed. And then there was this kind of asterisk of the Alliance Party. And I am reminded of a bad joke that nobody really outside Ireland understands, of somebody having a knife pulled on them or whatever in a dark alley in Belfast, and they're asked, are you a Catholic or a Protestant? And they thought they were clever saying, I'm an atheist, and the person says, are you a Catholic atheist or a Protestant atheist? So my question is the Alliance Party a Catholic neutral party or a Protestant neutral party?
Well, I don't know the religion of quite a lot of my colleagues because it doesn't actually come up very often, but we are actually in the Good Friday Agreement. It does say that you can be British, Irish or other, and you can be both British and Irish. So Alliance would fall into the camp where we have people who have aspirations to be and remain British. We have people who have aspirations to be and remain Irish. And we have others who see themselves as Northern Irish and like having sort of that dual nationality position. So Alliance is more aligned to the day-to-day politics of the place rather than the constitutional position. So we would look more at the economics, we would look more at education, at health, at all those types of political things rather than the constitution. We don't frame what we do as to where Northern Ireland may or may not be in the future. We were set up originally in 1970. We are actually older than the DUP as a party, but we came together at that time, which was, to be honest, the year I was born, so I really am a Troubles baby. We came together at that time to provide an alternative to that polarisation in politics. Now, I have to say there were a number of my previous colleagues who paid the price for that through being shot and being damaged. And that hasn't really stopped because I've had my own office in more recent times firebombed. We don't fall along those political divisions. We are seen very much as being in the middle, or as I like to say, we're on one side of the fence, actually trying to deal with ordinary politics, and everybody else is on the other side of the fence, tying themselves up with constitutional matters. We are open to being involved in the conversation, but as we have always said, if there ever comes a time when the Secretary of State decides that there will be a border poll put in Northern Ireland, of course there would have to be a border poll in the south of Ireland at the same time, I would be one of the people who'd be knocking down doors to say, can you tell me actually the information that I need to know to help me to take and make that decision of what way we're going to be, because I want to find out what the implications will be for people living in Northern Ireland, what it will be for my family. It'll not be politicians that will decide a border poll. It will be ordinary men and women who will be voting in that. And I'm one of them. And I just need to know, would it be better in a United Ireland or better for me in a United Kingdom? And it boils down to simply the facts, the evidence, the economics, whether it's going to be good enough. And then we have to think about, how is Northern Ireland going to react to this? Are we going to go the other way from the Troubles where the loyalists kick off? We need to see how that would happen. I imagine that there would be some sort of transition arrangement would happen if a border poll ever changed. But yeah, so Alliance Party is that party that is very much seen as different to the nationalists and unionists. We are treated very differently, I have to say, because of the Good Friday Agreement, which I fully support, in that my vote doesn't count in the Northern Ireland Assembly in the same way as a nationalist or a unionist, because it's the cross-community vote, interestingly enough, leaves out the cross-community parties. So Alliance
I just
is
want
not
to give the listeners a background on that. So with certain matters, there's a requirement that you get a minimum vote from both the nationalists and the unionist parties as they are registered. And there's no requirement at all from you guys. You could all vote against it and nobody would pay any attention.
Would make no difference whatsoever, which is it's increasingly difficult when you do have a growing number of Alliance members sitting in the chamber. When it comes to big decisions like, for instance, on the budget for Northern Ireland, we have no say. At this stage, for instance, we have an impasse where the Northern Ireland Assembly can't sit because the DUP have a veto. We can't do anything about that veto because as a cross-community party, unfortunately, our vote is not included in a cross-community vote, which could see a speaker brought into power and First Minister and Deputy First Ministers elected. In the same way that currently Alliance hold the Justice Minister, and Naomi Long had to be decided on
party leader
by a but her position as Minister for Justice was decided upon by a cross-community vote, which is interesting. Whenever she comes to the Assembly chamber, if there's a cross-community vote taken on a matter that she's bringing through as Justice Minister, her vote doesn't count on it. So there's some things that we would like to see move forward to recognise the diversity in Northern Ireland, that we're not all unionists and nationalists, not all of us have that political outlook, and that we have a fairer representation. Like the Green Party, for instance, wouldn't be involved in it, it's not allowed to vote in a cross-community vote. There are lots of parties there that we would like to see have more of a vote, and we're taking up more of the space in the Assembly. You know, when you're sitting with 20+% of the Assembly unable to take part in votes, it makes a bit of a mockery of the system.
Okay. One thing that because I do want to know, and Northern Ireland is a small place, as is the South, really, and everybody knows everybody. But one thing I just want to get more of a feeling for people who might not be so familiar with, as you're aware, way back in history, and I was looking at the exact figures because I was talking to Joel Keyes in the previous podcast, from the inception of Northern Ireland, from the creation of Northern Ireland, right up to the abolition of the Northern Ireland Parliament, the old Northern Ireland Parliament in 1973, unionist parties basically absolutely regularly got 2/3 of the vote. And there was pretty much always the Ulster Unionist Party, and the only time that wobbled at all for them was when there was some other competitive unionist party, and in one case the Northern Ireland Labour Party did quite well, but that was very explicitly also a unionist party. Its allegiance was to GB and the British Labour Party, although the Irish Labour Party also did manage to win the odd seat in the Northern Ireland Parliament. But it is very clear now, with Sinn Féin having the largest number of MLAs and also the largest number of votes, although by no means a majority, that the unionist vote has eroded very considerably. And what I'm trying to get an idea of, because Northern Ireland very much is a hereditary place, the people who vote for you, would they, maybe not themselves, but would their parents have been people who would have traditionally voted unionist? Do you have much of a either membership or voter base whose family backgrounds would have been voting nationalist?
We do. We have people who come from, like myself, I came from a very staunch nationalist family. In fact, my grandfather ran for the Workers' Party way back, and it would have been considered then to be a nationalist party. But Alliance is made up of those people who, to be honest, have moved beyond the Troubles narrative. These are people who want to see fairness in society. And in the South, you have had some changes have happened where, through a citizen's vote, you now have same-sex marriage. You have that more inclusion that happens with women's rights. And that's the sort of people who are coming forward and are voting for Alliance now, people who want to see progressive liberal politics coming through. And nationalism and unionism isn't offering them that solution. And I
just want to pause you on that because, and you said that you personally came from a nationalist background. The Workers' Party was a splinter group or an offshoot from Sinn Féin at one point. But what's your sense in terms of the pre-existing split in Northern Ireland? It seems to me, just looking at the demographics, that a big chunk of unionist vote has disappeared and a big chunk of Alliance vote has appeared. And there is a joke about I'll leave the historic jokes alone after this one, but that in 1945 in Italy, 20 million fascists went to bed one night and the next morning 20 million Christian Democrats woke up, and the fascism was sort of dealt with like that in Italy. I don't want to equate any particular tradition in Northern Ireland to that, but it does seem, if you just look at those figures, that the alliance vote is coming from people who might otherwise have been expected to be nationalists, not least because your own constituency was pretty much exclusively unionist, and now you have 2 out of 5 alliance MLAs.
And this is where you see a demographic change. Younger people are coming through, and younger people, and now I'm not saying that all alliance voters are younger, because quite a number of them are my age, middle age and older, but those younger people, they were born after the Good Friday Agreement. They have no ties to that style of unionism or style of nationalism, and they're looking for something and somewhere and a party that they can vote for that gives them what everybody else in the world has. It gives them a say on social matters. And I think that's what's happening. It's not necessarily that someone's not voting for DUP. The numbers that are
no, but their
available,
parents might have expected them to vote for DUP.
I'm
going to tie you down on this. And you can refuse to answer if you want, but I will make it explicit that you're refusing to answer. That vote is coming from people who are children of unionists and people who culturally might have been expected to be unionists, not exclusively, but predominantly. That is true, isn't it?
I wouldn't say that would be predominantly, because there are more people in Northern Ireland. Our census is due out this autumn that designate as Northern Irish. And that's the difference. People may, their parents or their grandparents may well have been unionist.
That's what I mean.
But today, those people don't see themselves as unionists, and they have moved beyond that to want to be in a society that's different. So it's a bit like, as you have made your joke earlier, are you a Catholic or a Protestant atheist? We have still that second religious question in our census in Northern Ireland that asks people, you've said you have no religion or you're another religion, but were you brought up as a Protestant or were you brought up as a Catholic? Yeah. And that's where I believe that we need to step away, because the demographics in Northern Ireland are not interested in that anymore. Unionism and nationalism is a political ideology that is no longer the only ideologies in Northern Ireland. There's ourselves, there's the Green Party, there's other parties out there, and it's more about day-to-day politics than it is about that constitutional issue.
Yes, I accept that, and I understand that, but people will want to kind of have an idea of why the Alliance Party has made this leap forward and who are the types of voters who are doing that. And would I be correct in my guess that what's happening with an awful lot of the people who are voting for you, and I think you're right to say that your average voter is younger than average, you are stronger in those younger demographics, that you have a lot of people who are essentially not necessarily sick of the politics of their parents, but that just don't identify with it. And for them, live issues, sometimes rather than party issues, they're more interested in single issues. They're interested in climate change. They're interested in gay marriage, gay rights, and other civil liberties types issues. And that attracts them to you. And it sure as hell doesn't attract them to, for example, the DUP. And if you were a hardline unionist looking at this, you might be right to feel threatened, because you're saying, hang on a second, these alliance people are taking away from us the voters who, as they see it, who we own. Do you think there are some hardline unionists who think like that?
To be honest, I don't. I really don't. I'm in a unionist constituency, because there are, a number of unionist MLAs who sit alongside me. But anybody who's a hardline unionist will always vote for a unionist party in Northern Ireland. But it's the other people who just go, do you know what? We go to work together. We're trying to get our kids educated together.
Oh no, I accept that, but it's their kids. Their kids are perhaps shifting vote, and then the party leaders are saying, hang on a second, you should be from a unionist family. What the hell are you doing voting for the alliance? Because, and the reason I'm asking you this is particularly with the flags protests that were in Belfast for a while back. The alliance voted for a compromise on that, and that attracted just a spectacular amount of rage and anger from hardline unionists, which I think can only be explained by the fact that they were viewing the alliance as traitors. Is that accurate?
Well, there was 40,000 leaflets put out in East Belfast that said exactly that we were traitors, and it ended up, sadly, in quite a few of my colleagues being attacked. That was 10 years ago. I think that people now look at it and go, do you know what? As others have said, John Hume, I think it was, said, you can't eat a flag. People are more It's the fact that when you're in alliance, you can say, I have no problem with the union flag. I have no problem with the tricolour. I have no problem with anybody's political identity. Now, can we move on and work out why we have so many people sitting in the health waiting lists? It's that realism, I think, that younger people and families and even people who are waiting on those health waiting lists are looking at and going, do you know what? We're fed up listening to this diatribe constantly going on, themans and usans, and it's more than that. And Northern Ireland is moving on like that, and that's why Northern Ireland, as I say, there will be those who are diehard unionists or nationalists who will always vote that way, and I respect them for having their own rights to vote that way. But there's others of us who are trying to do something else, who are trying to look beyond that and say, look, the constitutional question, whether it comes or not, that is not in my gift to do. But today I can help make sure that your kid gets into the right school that's going to help them to achieve all that they want to achieve. So that's where people are coming to us and going, do you know what? Other countries can have politics where they talk about normal things, and we would like that too. And I think that's where our liberal young people are coming through, and they're saying, you know what? We've been through a lot in Northern Ireland. We've had the troubles. We have had peace times, and we don't want to be going back to that. We don't want to be involved in either way with unionists or nationalists, because it's time for us to make this place work. And the only way we can make it work is if we're all in this together.
Essentially, there are a lot of people in Northern Ireland who just want to live in a normal country.
Absolutely. And so many of us that came through the troubles do not want to go back to what that was. I do not want to have to walk into a shop and be searched. I don't want to have no-go areas where I'm not allowed to go to because I'm from a Catholic background, or because I'm going out with a Protestant fella and I can't possibly be in that place. We don't want that. We don't want that. And the riots and things that happen, and that hatred that we see at different times of the year, whether there's cultural expressions happening, we don't want to see that turn into violence again. We want to be able to get on with each other. Thankfully, some of the procedures that were put in place, like for instance, fair employment, has helped people to work together. People are shopping together. Lots of people are now sending their children to school together. So we want to just get on with life. We don't want to be harking back constantly to what was in the past, or what may happen in the future. We need to get on with now, and that does take alliance to have some quite difficult decisions where we do say, hold on a minute here, we're not going to remove the flags entirely. Why don't we have the compromise where it's flown on what the royal household says, and there's designated days for that? And that's what we did, but that's when people lost their minds. And unfortunately, the Ulster Unionists and the DUP put out that leaflet, and a poor policewoman was firebombed in a car over the head of it. And many of our people were threatened. But that's the hard decisions that you have to take when you're trying to move on through peace. If you just constantly try to satisfy one side or the other, then you're always going to upset someone. So we try to be that mediator. Some people think that that's all alliance do, but then we rock the boat from time to time when we say, actually, it's this middle ground. It's the integrated education. It's the power sharing. It's the shared future stuff that needs to take precedence over everything else. And maybe at that stage, then nationalist unionists get a bit threatened, because what they've always had control over, they no longer do. And there's other people coming through that are looking to move things forward.
One other, and by the way, it's lovely to speak to you, and you seem like an entirely normal and reasonable person. and it's sad to have to remark on that, because sometimes when you talk either about Northern Ireland or to people from Northern Ireland, that's in short supply. But you nevertheless have to cope with a situation where, and I don't want to use pejorative terms, but you have to cope with a situation where a large majority of the population isn't engaging in what might in any other Western European country be considered normal politics. And I can hear, and I know from your platform and so forth, that you come from a generally liberal sort of centre-left type position. And the one issue that seems to crop up from that point of view is that the unionist parties, whatever about their voters, and I think they perhaps poorly represent their voters, but both major unionist parties, in fact all three if you count the traditional unionist voice, come from a conservative position on social issues that, much of the world having moved on and them not, is beginning to seem more and more extreme, and are also, I think, pretty far to the right in terms of economic issues. And does that present perhaps a problem for you in the sense that means that you are likely to be ending up, given that Catholic stroke nationalist stroke Irish nationalist politicians, SDLP, Sinn Féin, also perhaps you'd include People Before Profit, you're more likely to be ending up voting with them on bread and butter issues than with unionists. Does that cause you a credibility problem?
It causes me an issue in that it's always made out that Alliance must be part of this, they use the phrase, the pan-nationalist front. When we look at our stance on things, certainly when it comes to social issues, there are an awful lot more parties that are voting alongside what our thoughts are through Alliance. But economically, we may well vote with the DUP because we can be not conservative with a large C, but conservative with a small c. When we think about what about the taxpayer and how much can we effectively give people that can be paid in a sustainable way, for instance, through benefits. So there are things that we agree with unionists. There are things that we agree with nationalists. Unfortunately, the narrative is put out there that you must be one or the other. You couldn't possibly just be on the side of ordinary people on the ground, and you're voting for things that will help families, and you're voting for things that will help people that are marginalised, whether they're gay, whether it's a woman who's looking for an abortion. And that's where unionists tend to use this very conservative, with a capital C, to lambast parties that are voting in a different way to them.
When actually, but just Kelly, just for 1 second, you don't really expect to hear Gregory Campbell in a way that he might be giving a fire and brimstone speech about save Ulster from sodomy or whatever. You wouldn't really expect him to be giving that type of an emotional speech about the spending deficit.
But I do hear other unionists who now have maybe a gay person in their family, who are still committed to being part of the United Kingdom, who now are struggling with them listening to Gregory Campbell's, and they're very conservative unionists, because they don't understand where they now fit. Because they won't
no
vote
relation,
for Alliance.
I should say.
They won't vote Alliance because we're not a unionist party, but they're really struggling because there is no unionist party that represents people who are more liberal. And that's disappointing for me in Northern Ireland, because we do have a society that is learning to be together and to be more diverse and be more accepting. But just because you're a unionist or a nationalist, then you may not have a home if you don't exactly fit in with the narrative there. So unfortunately, in unionist circles, there are plenty of people who do still vote DUP, who will certainly vote Ulster Unionist, but who are really struggling with the fact that those parties don't represent who they are, which could be quite diverse people. TUV is a different matter. They tend to take the very nth degree on everything, but it means then that from my point of view in Northern Ireland, there are some unionists out there who are homeless, that they're still unionists and they still have to be respected as such, but who's representing them? So I know that we open our doors to everyone and anyone who needs assistance and who wants to come and get help, but it's very difficult when you see those people that they don't have political representation that's meeting all of their needs. And it's the same on the nationalist side. There's plenty of people who are conservative, quite conservative Catholics, and they're finding it more and more difficult. When the SDLP moved their position, for instance, on abortion, and it became a conscience issue, I know that there was a lot of conservative Catholics found it very difficult that they didn't have a nationalist party that represented their views, and were thinking about voting DUP. So when it comes down to those sort of legal, moral, social issues, people in Northern Ireland are really, really trying to look and say, do you know what? Maybe I don't need to vote the way that I've always voted because I've been unionist or nationalist. Maybe I can vote.
Are you essentially saying that there are now at least some people whose other issues would force them to cross the constitutional divide? I think you're probably right, yep. But that's a very, very small number, isn't it?
I don't know. I think it's grown, especially on the women's rights issue. We've seen so many people, quite conservative Catholics, that have said that they have no other option than to vote for the DUP. And again, people who are gay, who have been lifelong unionist DUP supporters, are now moving over to, could be the Green Party, because their environmental issues are more important, because of who they are is not accepted within the DUP. That they're finding that they have to vote elsewhere. It could be Alliance, maybe SDLP. So it's an interesting thing to watch whenever you go to an election and you look at the tallies and how they're coming in from the different voting areas, and you see actually in areas, my goodness, I wasn't expecting any votes from that area for the DUP or for SDLP.
But we have a transferable vote system in the north, like we have in the south, and the number of vote transfers that cross that sectarian line are very, very small. And I don't want to get terribly bogged down that. One question for you personally: if your constituency was 50 or 60 kilometres further south, what party would you be in?
Alliance. I've been an Alliance member.
No, it's further south, as in south of the border.
Oh, for the south. Do you know, I don't know. I honestly don't know, because I know that slight differences between the parties, but I would have to look. It's a bit like being the cross-border issue, the border poll. I would need to actually sit down and really go through and say, what does this party stand for? Sometimes it feels like you could just put a bit of paper between them, but it would be a difficult one for me because I don't know the system as well.
That's okay. At least that's an honest answer. But I want to get on to one other thing for you, and you'll be aware of the Ashcroft polls, which have at different times given results that would possibly be making Ulster Unionists, committed Ulster Unionists, sweat. And one of the results on that, in fact, showed 51% of people in favour of uniting. If you exclude don't knows, it was 51-49 with a nationalist outlook. I think that might have been a rogue. But what is unmistakable is that if you break down the demographics on that, you see that the only demographic that has a real unionist majority are the over 65s. And if you spread out the demographics in order, it looks like steps of a stairs until you get down to the 18 to 25s, who are something like 70% nationalist. And there are indications that people who are under 18, if you look at school enrollments and so forth, are even more strongly nationalist. It may not be 51% in favour of joining the Republic now, but this is coming down the tracks to us, and there is no stopping this train. The question will have to be answered. And the one thing that really strikes me is that whether you talk to people in the Orange Order, or whether you try to talk to people, maybe from a loyalist, more working class background, or people who are in the DUP or even in the UUP, and you try to say, well, look, in the event of reunification, what would your concerns be? How could it be made best for you? If you look at the nuts and bolts of that, the answer that you get is either it won't happen or nothing. That's dangerous, isn't it?
Well, I think actually the other side of that is if we're heading towards a border poll, and I think, to be honest, there's a lot of really interesting conversations that had to be had. And to be honest, a lot of people ask people in Northern Ireland what their issues are with it, or what they're hoping for, or what they would hope wouldn't happen. They're not asking the same question of people from the South. And I would love to see how that comes out, to see what people think. Are there parts of Northern Ireland's processes that could work, or is there a concern that will actually bankrupt the whole country? But the other thing that isn't happening is there's nothing that says to somebody like me, the reason why you need to stay part of the United Kingdom is X, Y, Z. And it used to be that people would say, but if you go into United Ireland, we're not going to have the National Health Service. Well, to be honest, the National Health Service, everybody's languishing on waiting lists at the moment. People are paying money to get to see consultants so they can get higher up a waiting list. So the National Health Service isn't that golden egg, that was held up to say this is what you need to keep hold of. I think that there needs to be the conversations. What is it that Northern Ireland would want to stay as part of the United Kingdom? But again, I would love to hear that conversation coming from people who live in the South, to say why they would want Northern Ireland to be part of a United Ireland, because that's the part of the argument that you don't really hear. Now, my ears are open enough that I can listen to those conversations, and if I was asked to put my tick on a paper, then I would have the informed decision of what way I would vote. But there's an awful lot of people who have closed ears, that they won't even enter into the conversations. And unfortunately, that's
the issue I would focus on. That's the issue I want to focus on, because I think that the issue of the North becoming part of the Republic, or uniting with the rest of the Republic, if you want to put it that way. As you say, there are a lot of issues to be ironed out there, but it is something that is relatively well, the aspiration is relatively well understood for people who have that aspiration. But
only for those who have that aspiration.
Correct, yes, of course, yes. But for the people who would be hardline against it, or who would be tending against it but are open to persuasion, or people who are perhaps in the middle, there's almost no discussion, and that's the danger. There's almost no discussion of what aspects of that would be most problematic for them. How could those be diminished? And we get people, for example, like senior Fianna Fáil politician Jim O'Callaghan, who people think perhaps might be the next leader, saying things like the Seanad could be moved to Stormont so that you would have the Dáil sitting in Dublin and the Seanad moving, sitting in Belfast, and that would be a symbolic gesture towards inclusion of the unionist tradition. There are people such as like Eamon O'Cuiv who has suggested that United Ireland would join the British Commonwealth. I'm not sure that's as practical or not sure exactly what he's going after there. But that conversation is entirely absent a unionist input as to what would actually matter to them, isn't it?
Yeah, because a unionist, as I've heard many times before, if they start to talk about it, then it's almost as if they're creating the border pool. So by just ignoring it and keeping out of the equation, then they're just not getting involved with the conversations. But the middle ground are having these conversations. We're having the conversations where we're sort of saying, Seanad's moving to Stormont. Why? Why would we even have a Seanad? Because maybe we'll have a completely different system. It's that conversation is, how would things work? How would we together, all parts of the island, come together? Or how would it work? It's a bit like the protocol and, what's happening with Brexit. It's the fact that I'm a huge supporter of Europe and always have been really disappointed with what happened with Brexit. How can we maintain our open borders? How can we work together? How can we keep our relationships going? I think that in unionist circles, that is such a terrifying thing to even think that if those discussions were happening, then Westminster may well get involved in those discussions, and to them it feels like a fait accompli. That's it. It's done and dusted now. We're starting the discourse towards unification. I think from unionists, they see that as a threat, that the reason why they are unionists is because they believe in a union with the United Kingdom. And to even think about or talk about that, and that's where part of my work is this mediation, is to say to people, okay, then, but tell me what the issues are that you really cannot live with. What could you live with? They never tell you that. But the issues that they can't live with is this erosion of unionist culture. And when you try to get down into what does that actually mean, because there are Orange Marches, for instance, as an example, in Donegal. So, culture is something that doesn't have to be held back by boundaries. There's lots of people who are involved with the Orange Order all over the world. So where's the erosion happening? And unionists just have a difficulty having that conversation.
Is it possible they have that difficulty because that's a code for something else?
I honestly think that they do believe that it's erosion of their culture.
But I've asked this question, and it is difficult to get an answer when somebody, when you say exactly what does that mean, and somebody isn't able to give a clear answer. That does tend to indicate that that's not exactly what they mean, and you suspect that if you were to scratch the surface, that actually what they're talking about is they want the dominant place in a binary society, which is the reason why they can't answer.
Well, do you know what? I can't argue with you on that one, because up until very recently, Alliance and DUP shared exactly the same position on getting rid of the mandatory coalition within the Northern Ireland Assembly, so that we didn't force all parties. Anybody who didn't want to be in government, could have a voluntary coalition and move into opposition. And until very recently, until their majority had changed, they were for a voluntary coalition. And now that majority is gone, they want the mandatory coalition, which means that they still have a seat around the table, which is very interesting to watch, because for years they would have been happy enough to push nationalists out of government. But now, whenever the option is that they could be out of government and into opposition, they're completely against that. So I think
I'm sure you're going to be delighted to talk about DUP flip-flop, since they are your competitor party in your constituency for the most part. One other flip-flop, and people take delight in posting the clips of various DUP politicians on Twitter saying how wonderful the Northern Ireland Protocol was. I'm going to look back to one quote, which is about the unionists refusing to discuss a United Ireland. They are perhaps reasonable in that, if you think of the Napoleon quote of saying, once you have contemplated defeat, all is lost. But on the Northern Ireland Protocol, you can disagree over the economics of it, and it's blindingly obvious that if the UK as a whole, including Northern Ireland, had crashed out of the EU with no withdrawal agreement, that would have been economically catastrophic for Northern Ireland, particularly border areas, particularly for farming, but really for the whole place. But, and as you say, you are a child of the Troubles. I won't say any more than that. I don't want to give away your age. But the one thing you might remember because of that is that the first IRA ceasefire was exactly 20 months after the Single European Act took effect. So once the border, the economic border on Ireland disappeared, and people will remember the black and white and indeed in some cases colour photographs of, the stop customs somewhere between Newry and Dundalk. Once that disappeared, there was much less reason for a violent campaign, a violent nationalist campaign. And I think those two things are much more linked than people give them credit for. Within 20 months, the IRA campaign had effectively stopped for good, although it came back briefly and to a degree. And when you would have a situation with the Northern Ireland Protocol, that there would be friction in trade between Britain and Northern Ireland, but no friction at all between the North and the South. Economics makes politics. They are correct to say that it undermines the union, aren't they?
I don't think it does. I think there are issues with the agreement, and those issues need to be ironed out between the European Union and the UK government. Mm-hmm. I think that some of the matters that are being brought out are being brought up to cause problems. And we certainly know in Northern Ireland now, when we don't have an assembly, that ordinary people here are being used as leverage in negotiations whenever the Northern Ireland Assembly has no say whatsoever in those protocol negotiations. But there are issues with the protocol that need to be ironed out, and let's iron them out. Well, for instance, we have some issues with medicines. Mm-hmm. I'm a woman of a certain age who needs HRT, and we're having trouble getting the HRT stuff. So let's get the medicine sorted out. Mm-hmm. There's some issues with, for instance, pets traveling. Now, I'm just giving very general things. There are other issues with the paperwork that's used when we're going across the Irish Sea. But these are issues that can be worked out. I believe that there was now I'm a huge fan of the European Union. However, I think when they jumped very quickly, saying that they were going to take forward Article 16 before, that just left quite a few of us in Northern Ireland go, oh, please, you were doing so well up until that point, and then you shot yourself in the foot there. There's always negotiations. There's always a way forward. The protocol does need to be updated. It was pulled together, cobbled together because the original Theresa May deal had fallen through and the DUP and different people had gone against that. We have a deal that has gone through that the UK government has signed up to. It is causing problems, certainly, between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK, but let's get them resolved. I think that if there was enough will going forward, we could get that resolved, and we could have a border. It is an economic border. It's not a people border. If we can get that economic border sorted out the same way as we were able to do with the Good Friday Agreement, then we can move forward. But to use it as
there's a difficulty, though, Kelly. There's a difficulty because the Conservative Party, who will be in power for at least the next couple of years in Britain, we won't try to look further into the future than that, it suits them. It's a fantastic football to kick around to distract from everything else. When there's absolute chaos at Dover, that people are missing their holidays and there's 24-hour long queues, it suits people like Jacob Rees-Mogg to be able to say, well, this is all the fault of the French and it's the whole of the EU trying to punish Britain. And perhaps psychologists could have a lot to say about how much British politics imagines EU politics centres around them far and away above what it actually does. But the reality is that it's, from a British point of view, an irrelevant fight that it suits them to have. It keeps the Daily Mail and the Sun and the Daily Express on side, and it keeps other topics that they don't want on the front pages of the newspapers off the front pages, doesn't it?
It does, absolutely. And we know full well in Northern Ireland exactly what that's like. We had the election in May, and we haven't had a Stormont party. We haven't got a working government in Northern Ireland since May. And to be honest, the Secretary of State could call another election in Northern Ireland, but why aren't they? Because, to be honest, leave Northern Ireland off to the side. It's a pain in the neck, and let it sit there, because we have other things to do. We're in the run-up in Westminster. They're in the run-up to another election. It's a couple of years away, but they've almost taken on the American system, where they're already starting that battle now. And it's all distraction tactics. We have people who are really struggling with cost of living, and every time something is coming up that's maybe not suiting the Conservatives, then they'll wave something else about the protocol about. It's really unfortunate that we don't have governments that just centre on people
Mm-hmm.
and try to look after people and see what the benefits are and sit round tables and negotiate without running to the press first.
And in addition to that, if you were from Northern Ireland of any political persuasion, you would be reasonable in thinking that British politics just doesn't care about you. That, for example, and I mentioned this before, the death of David Trimble was kind of a small footnote at the bottom of a sub-page on the BBC News website. It was the number one banner headline. They essentially took over the entire page on the RTE website. And if you look even at the results of your own elections, they're covered vastly better on media based in Dublin than media based in London. And it is a fear, and I'm wondering, perhaps you can speak as a spokesperson for a largely unionist community. Isn't there, or is there a fear that the desire for unity amongst unionists is not reciprocated?
Well, the Conservatives are the Conservative and Unionist parties, so they
but
do.
But they're not really. Do they really care?
Yeah. Well, I don't think that they do. It's, as I say, Northern Ireland is a pain in their neck, and I think they would rather be without us. But Northern Ireland.
And how much is that internalised by the average person who, in your constituency, who votes for the DUP or the UUP?
Well, to be honest, if you talk to our fishing industry, which there's quite a lot of in my Strangford constituency, they are feeling more and more that Westminster just doesn't get it. I think that unionists, if they had a cold, hard look at how things are going, they would go, yep, Westminster, to be honest, couldn't care less about us. But it's part of the United Kingdom. It's part of the devolved settlement, and that's the way it should be. But really, Westminster, all they do is they ask the questions: how much money does Northern Ireland get compared to all of the rest of the devolved nations, and should they get that amount of money? They send over secretaries of state who take no interest whatsoever. They go out and they meet a few business leaders, and they take nice pictures in some of our lovely parks and gardens. But
I wasn't going to refer to it,
but
I've got Karen Bradshaw in my notes, a Northern Ireland secretary who essentially was a member of Boris Johnson's cabinet, whose sole responsibility was looking after Northern Ireland. It wasn't aware that there was a divide between unionists and nationalists in Northern Ireland. It just wasn't aware that that existed. You know, that's spectacular level of ignorance, isn't it?
Well, she had to be fair, she had a job when she was coming to Northern Ireland, the same as the late James Brokenshire, where to come over, be a Secretary of State, get the parties round the table looking at each other, not necessarily doing too much, and keep us out of the way so that we weren't annoying anybody in Westminster for a while. And that was when the direct rule part happened. So the Secretaries of State, then we had Julian Smith who came in. It was very clear he was in to get things sorted out, and he worked really well with the Irish government, with Simon Coveney at the time, and brought forward a new decade, new approach. So if they meant that they wanted to sort out Northern Ireland and they wanted to help Northern Ireland, then we would have Secretaries of States who were interested in here, who stayed here, who wanted to talk about the hard things, not just get pretty pictures taken. And we've had very few of those over the years, particularly from the Conservative Party.
I'm going to finish with one question, and I'm going to nail you down to an answer. My analysis is that eventually this will be sorted out with honey rather than with vinegar. Whichever community is able to convince the other side to be least hostile to its solution will be what will win. So if the unionists are less motivated to vote against a united Ireland, that will probably win. If the nationalists are less motivated to vote against keeping in the union, that's what will win. And the question I want to nail you on is, with knowing the political realities, who's going to do better on that?
Personally, well, two answers to that. Unionists always think that they come out better, but in the long run, it's always the other negotiator, the opposite side, that actually comes out of it better. But the other thing I would say to you is, we are getting to that point in Northern Ireland where even honey isn't going to sort this out. The only thing that may sort it out is a citizens' assembly, to have discussions on the way forward. Whether it's for a border pool or not, it's what Northern Ireland people themselves want.
Yeah, but I'm not going to allow you to wander from the question. Which side, knowing the politics, do you think will be able to give the least worst version of what they want to the other side?
That's what I'm saying. It's getting to that stage now in Northern Ireland where the honey's not even going to work anymore.
Okay.
I think that there are people so hard-lined now that it's almost like both sides see an end coming to this. And I mean, like, nationalists are saying there could be a potential for a border poll. Unionists are going,
Yeah.
So I don't think that honey, I think there's too much to lose or too much to win on this, that honey's not going to matter. And that's why we have it in Northern Ireland at the moment, where the DUP will not go into government, because it doesn't matter how hard it is hitting people in Northern Ireland with the cost of living crisis. They're not going in because they're trying to make a point that they will not be left sidelined.
Okay. Kelly Armstrong, MLA for many years, for the Alliance Party, for the Strangford constituency. Thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show. And while you're there, you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, and follow Kelly Armstrong at KELMBA. And get in touch if you can suggest a guest or a topic for the next show. Thanks again to all of the patrons on Patreon. As I said, we don't get anything like some of the other Irish podcasters that I could mention, but it pays for things like web hosting. We basically do the podcast for free, but if you could do the same as the current patrons and donate the price of a pint of beer or even a litre of milk once or twice a month, please do go and sign up at patreon.com/here'show. That link is on the website. Also there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone or by email. All that information is at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. The assistant producer is Kevin Wolf. Thank you for listening.
از گلوی تو تا صدای ما بلا چاو بلا چاو بلا چاو 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 میپریم از خواب یه شب مهتاب یکی میگه آی آدم ها یا همه با هم یا همه تنها ما که بیداریم تا فردا خاک این گندم تو خیابونه خوشه خشم من و تو تشنه بارونه حق ما کم نیست زانوی غم نیست قلب ما که دور از هم نیست دنیای تاره این یه آغازه پنجره تا رویا بازه از گلوی تو تا صدای ما بلا چاو بلا چاو بلا چاو 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 میپریم از خواب یه شب مهتاب یکی میگه